What's up? I am David Long. Welcome to the bi-weekly Integral Community Meeting. Number 2, about Integral 2.0. When we did a poll in the group about what we wanted to talk about, last time Integral Leadership and Integral 2.0 tied. So I was like, all right, we'll do one and then we'll do the other. And I really meant to do a talk about this in the group live sooner than like right before the meeting, but things have been kind of crazy lately. So I'll just briefly recap what I said, and then we'll do like a round where we pass it around and briefly introduce ourselves to each other. Actually, we'll just do that first and then we'll come back around. We'll do like, hi, my name is, I live here. This is how I found my way to the group. This is how I, just something really brief. Hi, I'm David. I live in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and I found my way to this group very naturally. I am going to pass it to Kai, then to Damien, then to Matthew, and then to Sal, and we'll talk about Integral 2.0. Kai?
Yeah, hey, I'm Kai, and I live in Fayetteville, Arkansas, here in the US. I live with that guy right there, and I came to Integral because he started to talk about spiral dynamics and kind of opened me up to these new ideas. And so that's kind of how I found my way here. I think that's all I would need to say.
I am Damien. I'm living in Bordeaux, France, and I found my way through spiral dynamics some years ago, and I'm following David Long and his ideas throughout different Facebook groups.
I'm Matthew. I live in Seoul, Korea. I'm originally from South Africa, and I found this group through a YouTube video and then found the Facebook group.
I'm Sal. My original name is Sabil, and I'm originally Palestinian. I live in Dubai, the UAE. I came to know about David and his group and the community as well from trying to do philosophy and the spiral dynamic in particular.
Thanks everybody for coming. It is great to see your faces. It is great to be connected to people from all over the world doing this stuff. That's kind of amazing. What a cool community we have. So Integral 2.0. What is it? Well, it's kind of a rebranding of the integral emergentist revolutionary movement, which is very wordy, and that's why I'm used to giving things these type of titles that are like very specific that are not necessarily the most catchy. So yeah, I think Integral 2.0 is a good rebranding. But basically, the idea is we're pushing off of the old versions of Integral, including their strengths, and trying to work on some of the weaknesses. Also moving from more of like a early integral stage to a more integrally informed stage, which includes like less of a focus on just translation and more of a focus on transformation and creating new systems and creating a movement and all this kind of stuff. And I would say it also includes more of a focus on the Western Enlightenment project, because it has to build these new structures in a way that is acceptable and that has integrity, that people will want to actually get on board with because it stands up, not just based on pure assertion or some kind of dogmatic worldview. We have to take on some of these Western Enlightenment ideals like epistemic humility and things like this. These are some of the basic differences. This sort of epistemic humility and skillfulness, which leads to these other conclusions of emergentism, an anti-idealistic or like creative dogmatic kind of worldview, which frankly, in Integral, we should be beyond that stuff. A more life embracing this world, embracing kind of a focus with more of an emphasis on self-mastery, not just self-transcendence, and less spiritual bypassing, more engagement. Ultimately wanting to create more of like a movement or a lifestyle versus just products and events and like passively consuming, more like this kind of a thing where we have real engagements and like an ability to potentially build together and to put ideas on the table and do more. Embracing debates and disagreements. Again, this revolutionary focus, not in a violent way, but in a like, let's create a better world, both in terms of refining and building our ideas and maps together, but in terms of also creating new actionable solutions and building new structures on the other side of it. And then recently I added things like an anti-racist stance on the back of some talks that I had with other Integral leaders and dealing with racism in the Integral groups. You would think some of these things go without saying, but I guess they don't. So yeah, that and like a commitment to make engaging, affordable, and accessible content that that people can find, and things that are good for the community like that. Not keeping things behind a paywall and talking in straight terminology jazz poetry at people. in hopes that they'll understand. So, I mean, I also talked about some philosophical upgrades on the other side of this as well. You know, when it comes to quadrants, there's no more tetra arising consciousness all the way down and back. And so on the other side of that, there are major upgrades that come, like this nested quadratic holarchies and an understanding that quadrants relate to each other differently depending on the context, and cross-quadrant validation or tetra-validation, as opposed to just looking in the right quadrant for data. There's an attempt at something more like explanatory power across quadrants and stuff like this. Also quadratic zoom. So like that. So like those are like three big upgrades just to quadrants that bring tons to the table. So there's major theory upgrades to this. A non-corrupted map of levels, you know, where we don't stack Aurobindo state stages on top or assume all these third tier things, you know, like actually looking at the real data from developmental psychologists and doing a legit meta-analysis, as opposed to working backwards from a religious perspective and then projecting all of our religious assumptions onto higher stages of development. So, you know, there are other lines that we could potentially add as well, like David Hartful was talking about, adding racial identity lines and stuff like that. And states, we changed the names of some of the states so that way they're not also embedded in an idealistic bias like gross and causal, you know, words like this. And there also might be some in-between states, like flow states in between, like a waking and dream or archetypal state or something like that. So there's more to be fleshed out there as well. For example, Sal and I sometimes talk about types, and she's really into the Briggs-Myers types and stuff like that. And so I think it's really cool to think about how the functions of types relate to lines and how that might affect the development of different types as they grow. We have the Wilberforce lattice, right, where you have states and stages, and you have all this nuanced interpretation that comes from looking at how these factors relate to each other. Well, I think there's a whole new realm of data that can come out of understanding how types move through lines, move through stages. And so that's exciting stuff. In general, more of a focus on the Western Enlightenment project, more of an integration of sacred natural perspectives like paganism, occult knowledge, and like this like self-mastery and creative kind of stuff. And in general, like lower left and lower right, world-centric systems thinkers, activists, scientists, like zeitgeist movement people like Peter Joseph, like people like this who are like thinking about working on how we can create a new world together, new systems. This is the kind of focus in a nutshell, if you can call that one, that Integral 2.0 should be focusing on, in my opinion. And so on the back of this, you know, I want to invite people in the group to send me videos and stuff like this being like, hi, I'm David and I've upgraded to Integral 2.0. We can maybe start to put pressure on the community and start a conversation and a dialogue around some of these topics, as well as open up debates and start to maybe put some pressure and clean up our house and show up and grow up and clean up and all these kinds of things the integralists are supposed to be doing. Let's try to make Integral healthy again. That's basically what I have to say about that. So I'm going to open up the floor for thoughts and ideas about that, and we'll just go around in a round and see what comes up, and then we'll dig in deeper.
Super excited to be able to be a part of something like this. When I look around at a lot of other projects that are going on, like large movements of people and things like that, I see like where they do help and where they can make change and difference in the cultural zeitgeist and things like that. I'm thinking of like Black Lives Matter movements and whatever. That's just kind of the hot one right now. But like, there's a whole bunch of other movements, but it's like they have specific things that they're trying to address. And when I look at this project, it's kind of trying to address both a self-actualizing project of like your own mystery and your own becoming, but also one that's like, all right, well, we're becoming, and as we're doing that, how can we work together so that we can make the most change we can with the limited time that we have on this planet? And we have all these philosophical tools, very nuanced ways of nuancing data and understanding like where are the real problems, where are the real ways that we can participate. The more we go into the 21st century, the more difficult and complex the problems become. And it's just like these old ways of thinking, black and white, good and evil, like Republican, Democrat, whatever. And these things just don't they're not nuanced enough to really deal with the issues that are just arising and emerging out of the collection of all this stuff. So it is very exciting to have and be a part of these tools and to kind of be able to talk in a forum like this. So just wanted to say that to start. And it kind of leads into my just something that kind of popped in my head when David talked about the first thing with like this new integral 2.0 is like we're kind of rejecting the more dogmatic idealist perspective, and when it comes to maybe like spirituality and unfounded claims about the nature of reality and things like that. But I think there is something to be said about like a more pragmatic idealist perspective where you can see the potentiality of like who you are, what you have to offer, and what you can offer in the future if you set yourself up and start making certain decisions in the moment with these tools. And you can kind of like align yourself with these these philosophical positions and ideas, but then apply them in a pragmatic way, apply them in a way that actually is in alignment with reality on reality's terms, and understand where like an idealistic version of yourself is just a guiding force, and it's a very different thing than the actual physical version of yourself, and what is the actual real process of the change that you're trying to make. And
just to be clear, I'm specifically rejecting cosmological idealism there, not idealism in general or whatever.
Right. So that was something that popped up that I just wanted to put in some nuance in there. So I don't think all forms of idealism would be bad, but there are certainly forms of idealism that lead down rabbit holes that eventually lead to claims we can't make. And I, for one, have definitely been led down many of these rabbit holes, coming to this more integral 2.0 version where I'm able to look at these and go, you know what, yeah, that would be nice, but we also have to consider reality and the evidence that we have accumulated. On a more personal note, I'm wearing this specific this scarf here just because Timor-Leste, it's in Philippines, and they just won their independence and have just set up their own form of like democracy. This to me is it's a bit of a symbol for what this new movement is planting our flag. Like these people just won their independence. People are fighting and they are winning. And it takes just getting up and drawing a line in the sand and really being able to define your values and things like that. I think that's all I have for right now.
Yeah, it sounds exciting to kind of be, embracing integral, but then at the same time criticizing it and kind of building on it, and not being fixed in dogmatic views, getting stuck in a rut, looking at the theory and taking what's valuable, but then also adding, like you said, with the quadrants, and then also criticizing that which you find to not be valid. Actually, I think the idealism was one of the things that attracted me a bit to integral in the beginning, because it's very kind of alluring and intoxicating, and kind of all this thesis of that there is some kind of moving force behind it, and he starts off a lot of this arguments with that it can't all be left up to chance, kind of rebutting the emergentist view. So that's something that I'm kind of grappling with. I wasn't super into idealism, but it's a much more comforting thought if it is just based on kind of ideology and not on evidence. I guess that could be a reason why it's difficult for people to relinquish that, because there is obviously a reason why people are holding on to that. And there's a kind of metaphysical belief that could bring emotional comfort. So that's something that I'm kind of grappling with. That how to be emergentist, still find meaning, rejecting idealism, but what Kai was saying makes sense, and an idealism that's rooted in reality and not in something metaphysical. But it's still scary because it could lead you down a path of meaningless, or what's the point of it all? Not as far as nihilism, but it's scary. That was something that attracted me to Will, but it seemed as if he presented an idealist view that was grounded in reality. So it was a kind of trans-rational spirituality where you could say we can have both. We can have the belief that there is something supernatural, kind of mystical. I know he talks a lot about the perennial philosophy and that kind of thing, but then at the same time embrace the scientific view. But it seems as if maybe his views don't actually align with all the available evidence. So emergentism is a more rational view. It could be a bit scary to just get rid of that idea, just for me personally, but I think that maybe that is also a reason why others don't want to do it. The other thing that I was thinking about this week, I've been kind of depressed and anxious. There was this guy, I don't know if anyone else is familiar with him, Michael Brooks. He's a public figure. He had some shows on YouTube, a political commentator. progressive political commentator, and he just died suddenly, tragically, at a young age. Someone I used to follow. I didn't know him personally, but just someone I followed. It affected me a lot. He wasn't an explicit integralist, but he did do a few short videos talking about trying to incorporate integral theory into political theory. He was more focused on political commentary and activism and progressivism, socialism, that kind of thing. But it's related to the kind of skillful leadership and organizations and outreach. So that was something that I was really attracted to about him. He was a very intelligent guy, and also funny, and his sharp critiques of regressive political movements, right-wing movements, and then also embracing a left-wing movement that would really, not just because of the ideology, but because of how it could impact lives. I mean, getting people healthcare or housing, or not going hungry, not allowing people to go hungry. So he was interested in politics, but from a perspective of lifting people up, a social welfare perspective. So I think that's something that's lacking in the integral movement, but maybe integral 1.0. So that's why I brought that up. I mean, I want to also upload some videos of his in the group of people I'm familiar with him. Because I don't think there is some overlap, but like I said, he wasn't really part of the integral movement. But it's really affected me a lot. It affected a lot of people actually in the political left arena. So that's something that I want to educate myself on more. And the thing about Michael, his name is Michael Brooks. He was American, so a lot of his commentary was American. Political commentary was American, but he had a very global perspective. So he was even doing videos about Brazil and about my home country, South Africa. I think that kind of political awareness, but a global perspective, is important for Integral 2.0. That, I think, is one of Fulber's weak points. He doesn't have a good historical understanding and a theoretical understanding, even though he is into big theories, but he doesn't have a good, big theoretical understanding of politics. So that's something that needs to be brought more to Integral 2.0. And that's also related to the revolutionary aspects of transformational change. But you need to have the right thinking first. So I'm interested what other people's political perspectives are. After watching Michael's videos and also some other leftist commentators, I lean more towards the socialist perspective politically. So that's a question that I have for anyone. Is integral? I mean, I know integral should incorporate everything, but does it have to be? Can you be a hardcore capitalist, hardcore and Ryan, self-serving capitalist integralist? Or to me, it seems like people on integral would be falling more on the right side, but is it possible to, left side, but is it possible to more embrace capitalist ideology more and be an integralist? So that's all I have to say for now.
So I think my questions will be, I have questions, I don't really have comments. I think because I'm pretty new, I think my first connection to integral philosophy was through David, and so I was like, I think I know more about integral 2.0 than the actual integral today. I mean, so when you say like we want to upgrade to that, I don't even have a clear idea about how is it like changing from like now. So my question is, what is exactly the situation today, and what's the difference between, like, the basic difference between today's integral philosophy or ideas about when we say integral that compared to the integral 2.0? And you talked about what are the main unhealthy things that we are trying to fight or like resist or change. So yeah, I would like to have the main basic unhealthy things here. That's it.
So I am gonna comment and answer some questions, and then we'll pass it around some more and see what else we want to talk about. Let's see. Matthew mentioned meaning and value, and this idea of the way that people come to integral, or the way that people in general seem to be very into ideas that feel good, and that, like a lot of times people will say stuff like that, like, oh, I don't like the idea of living in a reality that's meaningless, all this kind of stuff. Like if you listen to Jordan Peterson, he's like terrified of this. He's like, oh my gosh, the nihilistic void, that's so terrifying. I actually think that basically both of these stories, the idealistic story, that's one story, and the realist story is another story. I think in general, people who tell the idealist story tell the idealist story as if it was a good, beautiful thing, and then frame it as opposed to the more realistic story as if that's a bad thing. You know, it's like, oh, there's meaninglessness, and it's just, I mean, who would even want to live in that kind of a universe, you know? And I think part of the problem is a lot of the people who have a more realistic view aren't very good at telling that story in a beautiful and sacred way. They're very good often at saying why the idealistic view is not only wrong, but also terrible. If the world does have some inherent meaning and value, then you're basically a pawn in someone else's game, right? But if there is no inherent meaning and value, then actually you have a lot of creative potential. You can create meaning and value, and we can create meaning and value together. That's kind of, to me, like the jewel on the other side of some kind of an existential awakening is like artistic creative control. Now, you know, some people might think of that as a type of responsibility and that that's heavy and negative, you know, to be like, meaning doesn't exist and it's on us to create a good meaning together. That's a lot to live up to. It's so much easier if things are just going to go according to plan and all you got to do is just relax into the flow of life and sing Kumbaya. And don't worry, love has a plan, God has a plan. It's all going to be fine. All you got to do is just feel the vibes. There's actually a beautiful way to frame what it is to be in an emergentist perspective. I think that there are beautiful poetic things that we can think about too. How Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about how we're stardust. Another way of talking about it might be like, we're the children of the universe. My father is the cosmos. My mother is the earth. And I've grown out of these things. I am the cosmos. I am the earth. You know, that's fucking beautiful, at least to me, you know. And actually a lot of these idealistic perspectives, like I said in the beginning, they're very life and world denying. They don't have a healthy attitude towards nature. They think that life is evil and fallen and sinful and gross, right? Reality is a gross illusion. Talk about an unhealthy way of thinking about reality. It's like literally all that we know exists and the only thing that could possibly really even matter to us. And these people are calling it gross. Well, I think that's fucking gross. I'm tired of that shit. I think there's a much more beautiful way of framing idealism, and maybe we could do a better job of doing that. You know, maybe that would be a worthwhile project of not just talking about the problems and the ways that idealism can be such an ugly and terrible worldview, but the ways that actually an emergentist perspective can be a really beautiful and wonderful worldview. And there's good poetry potentially to be had around that as well. So that's one thing. The other thing that he was asking about was socialism. So an integral perspective on these political issues harmonizes the collective and the individual as well as the conservative and the progressive, right? Of course, now that's a very blanket statement. So what actually generally tends to happen is that people will nest the version that they are less comfortable with in the version that they're more comfortable with. Let me give you an example what I mean by that. So there are people who are obviously more libertarian and more capitalist who are integral. And they talk about things like conscious consumerism or integral business or conscious capitalism, right? And so they frame the care for the collective within the context of individual values. But then the more transformative synthesis that I'm talking about is called collective individualism, which nests the individual within the context of the collective. So for example, it would be a type of socialism or collectivism, but the point of that collectivism would be to bring every individual up to their own highest potential, so that way the individual can also bring value back to the collective, right? So it's about a balance. Now, Saul Williams has this thing that he says, he talks about like, if you have a piece of paper and it's bent, the way to get it to come back to a balance is actually to bend it back in the opposite extreme way. So that way it comes back more to a center. Okay, maybe that's not the best example, but yeah, so I think it's going to be a little bit like that. We've gone far to an individualistic extreme, and we've lost touch with some of our collective values. So I think we're going to have to go back and correct a little bit and have a little bit more collectivism and authoritarian control. Like, well, and when I say that, I don't mean the authoritarian control of an individual powerful person on top who's like the king or like a dictator or anything like that. I mean, I'm definitely in favor of democracy, but not voting. I'm going to try to not go too far down the rabbit hole of this kind of a thing. I think that we can have an open, transparent process that harmonizes democracy and science, where we can test things and prove it and refine it over time. And part of the problem we have right now is we have a very might makes right type of top-down legislation of taste or bottom-up mob rule type of system. But if we could actually start to use science and prove it and refine and see what kind of solutions can prove to be true, and like think about our system as humanity, the project. This goes back to the other thing you're talking about too. It is the Western Enlightenment project to do this stuff, because the idealist camp don't do shit. They bypass everything and think that God's going to take care of it. And the reason that it's the emergentist realist camp who is actually going to try to like create a progressive future is because we realize our responsibility and that this is it. So I mean, like, people think that these fundamental metaphysical ideas don't matter, but they are super fundamental to even how we relate to politics and action in the world, and like whether we even think the world needs us to do anything or not. So they're definitely related. But yeah, I hope this answers your question about the synthesis between the collective and the individual. The idea is that usually the individual themes focus on personal responsibility and a natural growth hierarchy. And we need both those things. We need personal responsibility. We want people to excel personally and to achieve higher stages of development. But the idea behind the collective themes is making sure that everyone's basic needs are met and providing opportunities for everyone's growth. So I think that these things actually need each other. You can't really have one without the other. You need both opportunities and responsibility. You need both to be able to have growth. And honestly, the greatest wasted resource is human potential. Like the way that Republicans think of welfare as like handouts to these ungrateful, undeserving people is like a really short-sighted and unfortunate way of looking at things. We need to take care of everyone's basic needs and make sure that they're met so that way we can all thrive. Just because you're born in an economic class doesn't, like, you could be the next Einstein, you could be the next Mozart, you could be the next whatever. And like, to the extent to which we don't invest in people's potential is to the extent to which the whole society and everyone misses out. I'm going to quickly try and answer Sal's question, and then I'm going to pass it off. The differences I was going for, those points in the beginning, the difference between integral, the original integral, and integral 2.0. When I say no idealism and no creationism, well, Ken Wilber basically believes in like a Eastern version of creationism. He believes that there was this I amness before the Big Bang that became everything. So, in terms of emergentism, he doesn't believe in emergentism. He thinks that consciousness pre-existed reality. And he doesn't clearly make this pre-trans distinction. I'm claiming that he commits pre-trans fallacy number 2 when he does this, that he's basically taking some religious symbolism really literally. And I'm just going down my list here of the differences. So this is also a problem with a lack of epistemic humility. He's making claims beyond his ability to back up or know about. When someone asked him, why should we care about problems or suffering or pain or any of that? He said, if you're in a dream at night and there are people starving, there's 2 ways you can end their hunger. The first is that you could try to feed them in the dream. The second is that you can wake up and it will end their suffering immediately. So this is an out of touch, delusional relationship with reality. This is not embracing life or like embracing your creative responsibility. This is like some spiritual bypassing through and through. And when I said movements and lifestyle versus products and events, basically they're just endlessly talking and keeping all that stuff behind a paywall. And it's not really accessible. It's not really in the world. It's not really about trying to do anything. There is no integral movement as of yet. There's just us really smart people selling you products and hosting events, things like that. And these events are ridiculous and often like crazy unaffordable and unaccessible. So when I say embracing debates and disagreements, Wilber doesn't debate his critics. Wilber doesn't deal with his critics. He just has people on and talk about how much we agree with integral. Or with Buddhism in this case, actually trying to have a revolutionary movement. That's the difference. And, when I said anti-racism, these other integral groups, they won't kick racists out of their groups. They allow Nazis to be in their groups and quote Hitler, and they won't kick them out. Like Corey DeVos won't kick explicit racists who quote Hitler out of his group. I mean, come on, like how much discernment do you need to be able to make a clear distinction here? Yeah, and then a lot of the content, like I said, it's not really engaging, it's not really affordable, it's not really accessible. So those are the main distinctions, those are the problems I'm pointing to. That's what I'm pushing against. And I'm going to pass it to Kai.
You said something about types and how it's something that we all accept. Yes, everybody has their own type, but when I do look at that and see how these different types interact with the world, it is really interesting to see the vastly different ways that people interpret reality itself, and that because there are certain positions that you start at with the whatever information's coming in, whether it's being processed through your sensory data, and then you're forming an idea about like what's going on, or are you doing that interiorly, like on your interiors, like are you intuiting a lot, are you thinking logically, are you all these kind of things. It shapes and molds, and it it's all formed through the way that we have grown up and dealt with the world around us. It's just kind of like a natural process that we are slowly getting better at in some way, shape, or form. We have a way of like navigating through the world. But, I think it can definitely be a very powerful tool, and I feel like it gets in the way sometimes because especially when trying to have conversation or, make connection, if somebody is thinking more logically about the topic or situation, they may not hear the concerns or the passion that the feeler is feeling. Like they might not be able to describe with these logical ideas and premises and like, here's my conclusion, this is my evidence for why I experienced this, and so like the feeler is very much in their world, and how the sensitive self is dealing with that. I also
and this relates to what Michael was talking about how different people end up in different camps based on whether they're a more feeling type or a more thinking type or something like that, and that we have to be able to reach out to them and resonate with them as well. Is this kind of where you're going with that?
Yes. Basically, like, okay, so if this person's a more feeler type and they're holding on to these more idealistic views, it makes sense, because in idealism, I'm a feeler, and I've had to learn how to be logical and how to take on this more emergent, rational perspective. Because when you are a feeler and you're in that idealism, it makes sense. Like you're completely connected to your sensory internal world, and it's like you feel it. It feels absolutely real. And but once you start to deconstruct it a little bit with these more third-person perspectives, and you kind of put yourself in context to the rest of everything that's going on, you can kind of navigate through, okay, what's like me physically on the inside, and what were like ideas that I was applying to these feelings I was having, and how was that changing how I interacted with the world and people. And so I think there's definitely something to, like, there's real hidden potential inside of types that we just don't really have a full like thumb on the pulse of that potential for communication within the community. Like I think most people at Integral have the philosophy and some of the theory online and their own ideas, and they have all this information that they're processing it through, but it's being processed through a type. It's being processed through, that meaning-making matrix that they've developed in their life, for 30 years, 60 years. If they've never taken time to look at how they process information, then it's going to have a serious impact on how they, understand reality and relate to it.
Real quick, Sal, can you tell us what the percentages are like between what percentage of people are more feeling types and what percentage of people are more thinking types? Weren't you saying something to me about that pretty recently? Maybe Sal went away for a moment. When we come back around to her, we will re-ask her that question.
I think one of the biggest reasons why we haven't really been able to maybe have a better conversation around types is just because it really is still kind of in this early kind of woo stage right now. Like, I think the Myers-Briggs, as far as the pop side of it goes, like, oh, I'm this type, so then I'm just going to act like this type and then make a virtue out of only processing information like this, and I'm proud of that. I don't think that's a healthy way to understand type. They're what the pro users of the type, like there's this great channel called Objective Personality, and it's a channel where they look at the underlying processes like introverted thinking. How is the person processing information? Like, how is it then moving to this? And then how is it moving over to this? And having a broad scope of the Jungian.
The different functions
And things like that.
Yeah.
There is, because it's not just like, oh, I believe that this is something that's like true, like astrology. Like you have to have, there's like a level of belief that you have to have in it. Like with the Myers-Briggs stuff, at least it's like, no, I don't believe any of this stuff is true. It's all right, what are like patterns that we can apply a meaning to that seems to be a pattern that stretches across large groups of people? Well,
it's the most scientific version of it too, it seems like, because I keep interrupting you. It's because they all have also correlated it to brain structures and stuff like that, where I think that they can predict within like 4 different types or something based on looking at your brain early on what type you'll be. So they've been doing studies around this stuff for a while, and it seems like, the Briggs-Myers stuff is probably the most scientific of the typing structures.
Yeah. And it is really interesting, because if you can understand your type and understand how your default, like where you're at, like you're practicing certain lines with your type. And so like for me, I'm much more of a visual thinker. Like I've been a photographer for like 8 years, and it's like I'm a very sensory person too. I'm highly intuitive, and so like the way that I deal with people and information is leads me towards certain like skills that I've just naturally kind of developed. And so it's like everybody is doing that, but in their own unique way within this blob of a type that we naturally kind of default into just because of whatever, our brain chemistry, or I feel like more our nurture, like what's the environment that we grew up in. I'm sure there is some nature.
These are all factors.
Right.
Hey, Sal, I see that you're back now. Can you tell us real quick, like what the percentages are between the more thinking function types and the more feeling function types? Like, didn't you say that the feelers are significantly dominant?
I'm not really sure about the percentage, but it's over half people are more feelers, as well as more half people are sensors than intuitives. And their stereotypical behavior kind of like correspond more to a more blue and orange, sometimes even red stages. So that's the whole idea from trying to see how these people can correlate to the stages by breaking down into their functions and seeing what kind of functions like match to what kind of lines. And by understanding the different lines that develop throughout the stages, like for example, what develops from the lines from blue to orange, and what from orange to the green and stuff like this, we can first of all understand like in a general sense what kind of personalities would be more into like stucking into a stage, and why they're stucking in this stage, and what kind of functions they have to work on that corresponds to some of the lines that they of course have to work on in order to go to the next stage in the spiral dynamics. So that's the idea. Hope I answered the question.
Yeah, that's great. And some people and some types are probably more likely to make it to integral than other types too, right? Like INFJs and probably like INTJs and some of these other types are probably.
Probably, yeah, and actually they are all actually really rare in the percentage. So it's actually telling you something that why they're like maybe 1-2% of the population, and it says something. So we're just I'm trying to see if there's something for real or not. And to answer, I think, or comment on Kai's comment, these things should be dealt with not in a scientific or something. It's just a model. It's just a model that try to in part describe some part of reality. It's not like you are put in a box or something. The same with spiral dynamic. You're not put in a box when you say that I'm mostly blue, or I'm mostly integral, or I'm mostly orange or something. It's just models. So we're trying to see where these models can match and influence each other.
Right. And also knowing about this stuff, like it should inform the way that we create content too. Like if we realize that most people are feeler types and something like this, and then it's going to be important to, like I was talking about with Michael, it's going to be important to tell good stories around this stuff and to have, like you're saying, like as if you're going to be an emergentist, it would be nice to know why that's a beautiful and good thing to be. And not just from a rational perspective, but from a maybe more poetic perspective as well.
Yeah, because
Thanks.
when you're logical or rational or something like that, when you are like more leaning toward this, you don't really need somebody to tell you how that is the beautiful or the good thing to think about. When you are like more idealist or you're a feeler, you need somebody to, break it down for you so you can understand the value of being,
Let's pass it to Damien and then come back around.
Thank you for your last sentences. Very interesting about crafting the message to feelers or intuitives or whatever. Yeah, that makes me really think about projects, and it's a very good stuff. I will think about this. I had a question about idealism. I'm not sure I understand what's left of idealism in an emergentist perspective. I don't understand what part of idealism is compatible with emergentism.
Well, cosmological idealism isn't compatible because it's a metaphysical claim about the nature of reality. So in that kind of regard, there's a right and wrong answer to be had there. And I don't think idealism is the correct answer based on the evidence that we have. But in terms of like holding yourself to an ideal standard or something like this, or like having ideals about, like projected ideals that you work towards or something like that, that kind of idealism versus realism in the more like lay person kind of way, I guess. Because it's almost like if you're thinking about morality, right, you almost first want to figure out like what the ideal is, right? So it's like when we think about the kind of integral society that we want to create together, first we have to envision the ideal. We have to think about how that would work, and then we have to figure out how we can realistically start to work towards that. So I guess I'm saying that in terms of just projecting into future possibilities, I think some versions of idealism like that, where you think about your ideal self or your ideal creation, the ideal of your project, can help you to pull you towards that. But I still think you have to come back towards a realistic way to maybe accomplish that. And sometimes I think people who are idealists will get caught up in like a very like straightforward way to solve a problem. Like, for example, there's superstitious people everywhere. Let's just put them all in camps and re-educate them. This is a simple solution to the problem. It's like, well, maybe there's more realistic ways that we could start to work on that problem in the short term that will get us towards the ideal that we want without going straight towards this kind of a simple solution. Like maybe we could work to educate women. Educated women have less children. They're more likely to perpetuate blue ideas or something like this. So there might be more like roundabout ways to deal with problems, but I think it still can sometimes be helpful to know what the ideal is, because sometimes people will start by compromising on what their goal is because it doesn't seem realistic enough. And then they sell themselves short, and then they compromise on a compromise, and then they end up with this shitty thing. You know what I'm saying?
Okay, so basically, if I understand well, you're saying that there are two types of idealism. One type about ideal and one type about ideas. Ideals, so the one where you have great ideas about how to do the things, and you have an idealism about the nature of nature.
Right, exactly. One is a ontological or cosmological claim. The other is more like an approach to problem solving or to trying to figure things out. Do you want to say anything else, or should we pass it to Matthew?
No, we can pass to Matthew.
Thanks for the response that you gave to my question, David. That does kind of answer the difference between left-leaning ideologies and more conservative. That was the word I was looking for, libertarian ideologies. So it seemed like what you were saying, you don't really agree so much with the conscious capitalism solutions.
Well, I think that ultimately we need to include both translation and transformation, right? So those things can be good short-term solutions, like let's be good conscious consumers, like let's have an integral business if we're going to have a business within capitalism. But at the end of the day, we can't think that, I am a good consumer or I have a good business, therefore problem solved. It's like, no, that doesn't do it. That doesn't solve the problems. That's just you.
If there's a fundamental flaw in the system, it's just a band-aid solution.
Right,
so
exactly.
So yeah, that was the it makes sense what you said about having to overcorrect if their systems are really so skewed in that hyper individualistic, hyper capitalist position at the moment. That would be a reason to push more for the collectivist, socialist position, and then later on, if that does get more redressed, can incorporate more of the individualistic ideas. Not later on, but at the same time. But when you're working politically, I guess you need to outline your framework so it's easier to communicate that there are fundamental deficiencies in the system that need to be addressed on the collective level. I mean, at the same time, emphasize that people need to take personal responsibility, but it seems like a lot of right-wingers, I follow mostly, I'm getting this from observing American politics, that the right-wingers kind of just say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and everything will be all right, and without addressing the system as much, and saying, well, if any criticism of the system are kind of, well, they always frame it as you're not acknowledging all the great progress we've made. So they'll say things like, you say America is a terrible country, but it's actually the greatest country. So that's their criticism of leftists. So,
well, we're definitely the greatest at thinking that we're the greatest. That's just undeniable, right? So. But the good thing about
number one at narcissism.
Number one at narcissism, the best at self-confidence. But the good thing about this kind of way of talking about it and like seeing through the left and right positions and talking points is that almost everybody can kind of agree that both opportunities and responsibilities are important. And if you can validate a person on the right, let's say, by being like, yeah, like, listen, I hear what you're saying, we all need to take personal responsibility and really try our best. But it's also true that there are these systematic problems and that we need to create more opportunities for people to be able to thrive. And yeah, it's got to be both. It can't be one or the other. The problem isn't just with people and it's not just with the system, it's with both. And if we only address one, then we're not going to really be solving the problem. And I think actually a lot of people on both sides will agree with that. It's just that we get so bogged down in these left versus right kind of talking points that we don't even talk to each other. We just get caught in these like immediately, you're a liberal, you're a socialist, you're a Nazi, you're a fascist.
Yeah. I mean, I try to listen to both perspectives, but I feel like myself, I tend to gravitate more to the leftist perspective. I mean, maybe that's because of the media that I'm feeding myself. I'm listening to conservatives, but then I'm always feeding it through the leftist loop and looking at what the criticisms are the leftists have of the conservatives. Even when I'm listening to a conservative, I'm listening for I'm looking up for the critiques that have already been pointed out to me from leftist critiques. But I get what you're saying, though, that both are important. But maybe that makes sense why I feel a bit more resonance with the collective if it has been a bit skewed to the individualistic and capitalistic. I mean, if you just look at it like on the lower right side, quadrant, right, like distribution of resources and stuff like that, that's very obvious to see. Even though a lot of right-wing people don't want to point that out, but there is value in both. But I was thinking there was that thing in the moment in the debate between Peterson and Zizek, where Peterson said, personal responsibility, clean up your room. That's his big thing. And Zizek said, well, how about saying that to someone in North Korea? That clean up your room, it's complete. And then it was a very good point. It exposes the absurdity of it, but I mean, because that's an extreme situation. Obviously, we're not in that extreme situation, but there do seem to be some major flaws in the system. So while it is good to encourage personal responsibility, that can be undermined by the fundamental flaws in the system, which need to be addressed on a collective, systemic level.
That's a great point.
Yeah, so that's why I tend to. Maybe that could be one reason why I tend to.
Well, also a lot of these conservative voices are usually religious fundamentalist or racist or something like this too. So I mean, like there are, and usually when they're talking about personal responsibility. It's like strictly as opposed to trying to change the system. It seems it's like, oh no, there's no problem here. Everything's fine. You just need to work on you, and then you'll be fine.
Right.
You know, so it's like, it's not like they're just not acknowledging the problem, and so it is unrealistic. And yeah, so it's not that they don't have a good point. It's not that you shouldn't clean your room, even if you live in North Korea. Obviously, you should still clean your room. But clearly, you know, there are other problems as well. And yeah, so it makes it very hard to be sympathetic to some of these conservative. I almost want to say, like, you know, to me, that's liberal. Like, liberal is a focus on freedom. You know, I don't know. In America, it's a little bit confused because we always talk about things in terms of the social sphere, right? So like the conservatives are socially conservative and the liberals are socially progressive, right? But actually a lot of liberals are regressive. Like, they want to go back to nature. Like these postmodernists, like they're conservative, they're ultra conservative in other realms, you know what I mean? Yeah, or like, you know, I don't know, economically, maybe you could say conservative or something like that. Maybe some of them are progressive too. No, it depends on what we're talking about. But the people who are focused on individual freedom and individual rights and individual responsibility, like, to me, that's the more agentic liberal camp versus the social communal camp.
Yeah, I guess that the regressive aspect, an unhealthy regressive aspect of the left is extreme cancel culture, something like that. That's a regressive thing, wanting to shut down all debate and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's lots of ways in which the left potentially goes too far or too far to extreme. Yeah.
Wilbur calls it the mean green mean. A lot of his critics of that extreme left and extreme postmodernism, where you can go down a rabbit hole of everything is subjective.
Right. And we don't want to go to the antithetical move of like being like, oh, well, now we're pushing off green, so we'll go back and be like alt-right or something like this. No, you know, there is some kind of a balanced integral center. And I think it is around these versions of synthesis, these either like translation forms of synthesis, like how am I going to work within the system as it is, and this more like transformative version of synthesis that tries to include the social and agentic or collective and individual themes.
I guess that's the kind of audience that Jordan Peterson captured. People who are disenchanted with certain aspects of green, but then he's actually more traditional. Yeah,
more regressive. Exactly. He's like a postmodern traditional regressive or something. It's really interesting. He comes right up to the void and he gets afraid and he runs back. Quick, hold on tight.
Yeah.
It's scary out there. Do you have any other comments or questions?
That's all for the moment. I'll pass it on to someone else.
Sal? Did I address your point? Do you feel like you better understand what the old integral is like?
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any other questions or comments or anything?
Yes, I do have one comment about why most people feel like integral is more like into ideal thinking. I guess it's because it's just a guess, and correct me if it's not accurate, but I guess because a lot of people who went to study spiral dynamic at least think that the end of this stages is like obtaining enlightenment and like, you know, this enlightenment kind of like ideas. So that's why I think it like in the first place attracted a lot of people who are idealists. And I just want you like hear your comment about this.
I see Hunter's in here.
Yeah, I figured I would ask.
Buddy?
Doing good. How's everyone?
Good.
My name's Hunter. Sal, I want to make sure I understood your question because I caught part of it, but I'm kind of doing some work on my end too. But it was about kind of the appeal to idealists. And can you just rephrase that one more time so I can better understand?
Yeah, I mean, like the appeal for idealists to study or like call themselves integralists in the first place is because they think the end of the spiral is attaining enlightenment in this Eastern kind of like way. So I think that's why we see a lot of idealists go into call themselves integral and missing the whole point of what that actually is. And it seems like it's very subjective kind of thing. It's a subjective kind of experience. It holds no place for, whatever we're talking about here in Integral 2.0. So that's my comment. I want to see if anybody have any comment about this idea in exact.
Sorry about that. I didn't mean to dip away. What's up, Hunter?
Hey,
How you
man.
doing, buddy?
I'm doing all right. How are you, David?
Doing really well. It's because it's because Wilbur is Buddhist, and so if the founding member thinks that and he's framed it that way, that's I think why it's kind of become like that. Go ahead, Hunter. Though
I think there's more to it than that, though.
Okay.
I think that's certainly an element, but I think that in general, because I don't think it's just a thing of Ken Wilber as much as you look at multiple religions, and there's a sense in modern kind of lenses towards some religions, and I say this based on my experience with individuals who are practitioners within different religions, that there is kind of an ideal space that we like to hold in our heads in order to navigate the world. There's this distinction that maybe is important for us to make between what is and what ought to be. And a lot of times when I look at conversations in the world in general, but in this community, we talk a lot about what is and what ought to be, but sometimes we don't necessarily do a good job bridging the two. And I think that's really where work starts to happen, because there's if you're always talking about what ought to be, it's great to have an idea or a relationship with that. But honestly, that I feel like that should be something that's changing based on the accumulation of more information, the falsification of certain underlying beliefs that we might have, and being like, oh, that's wrong. What ought to be is actually different, because what I held for in my head, for instance, might not physically be possible. It might not be possible in the world because of any number of limitations that I just don't know about and I'm coming to understand. But this question of how we move from where we are now into that space, I think is a bit of an Achilles heel for a lot of thinkers and people who enter this space. Sometimes the more we learn, the harder it is for us to affect change in the world in a direct way, because as things grow more and more complex, sometimes we relegate ourselves to a space of pure intellectual complexity and parsing through that without much praxis, without much involvement on the ground. And so I'd said only some religions do this, and I think we can start to look at or at least have an appreciation for maybe a good example, like the difference between someone who might casually say I'm a Christian versus someone who might casually say I'm a practicing Muslim. One person might pray 5 times a day, the other may go to church once a week. Now, of course, there's variations there, but we could say that for the Christian who recognize, for at least a Catholic who recognizes all of the holy days of obligation, goes to church 3 times a week, engages in prayer, we could look at their religious belief system and say that it includes a practice element. Just like someone who prays 5 times a day, there's a practice that goes along with this, and that practice is something that is very there's an embodiment to that practice. It's not just what I see in the integral religion, which I mean in a way that's a bit disparaging, because I don't think it's I don't think a religion is really all this should be. There shouldn't just be this space of I'm engaging in the practice by engaging with the thought, because there's really this realm of no, you need to be doing something about what those thoughts are. And I think, David, you just made the comment about how that has to do with for instance, someone saying I shop responsibly, and for that reason I'm doing it, but you're not necessarily affecting the system in which everyone engages. And so what necessarily you're putting out in the world isn't creating more and more opportunity for that practice. It isn't engaging people in a way to kind of move together. It's just a bit like a solo journey. And if you want to be enlightened, that's great. Solo journey, go for it, go fast. But if you want to go somewhere meaningful and you want to go far, go together. It's an old African proverb one of my teachers has told us about, which I really like, because I think for me it's a good orienting framework to trying to address problems that I see in my community. I have to do that with people. I have to do that on the ground. I can live outside of the system if I want. I can live off the grid. But if that alternative isn't accessible to other people, if that alternative isn't something that others can start engaging in, it's not really an alternative. It's just me escaping, personally. That's an individualized enlightenment, as opposed to a collective journey of understanding in our context, in what is right now, and acknowledging we should go somewhere else. We should go with what ought to be, and we'll talk about that some, and then walk from where we are towards that goal and course correct. We're oh, that didn't work. We should have thought about that more. We should, we'll learn how to hear better, and we'll learn how to communicate better, and then we will, do better.
Man, I love how right on time you are with this comment too. That's so beautiful, and I feel like this also relates to what I was talking to you about, Damien, about the ideal versus the realistic. You know, there's like he's saying what we think what ought to be. That's like the ideal, and then there's like you know what we can really do about it, and like bridging that gap, and that is like a process. And I really like what you said about us achieving enlightenment together practically, something like that, through, and like this idea of practice. And to come back to Sal's question, and to maybe bridge the gap between what I said and what you just said, Hunter, is that like this idea of enlightenment is it's not that Ken Wilber's not right about, you know, people at the highest stages of human development being enlightened. It's just that enlightenment, as we know it, as we generally talk about it, is so embedded or thought about in the context of the Vedic traditions and the perennial philosophy and often Eastern traditions and stuff too.
There's kind of a reduction to that. I mean, I don't want to get bogged down in this part of the conversation, actually, because I think it stops being practical. So now someone could disagree and we could talk about it more, but I think there's a general agreement amongst people who are engaging in this sphere based on this particular one, based on what I see, in the forum on the Facebook, that, that is, I think in one of your videos, use like a mountaintop description and condensing or collapsing everything to that one mountain and being like, this is it. Because my experience with Buddhism, and, I have a practice that's in a Buddhist tradition, and it doesn't hold, it doesn't engage kind of in the praxis in a lot of these modes of thought, and it doesn't give importance to things that I see being stressed in some of integral conversations, from Ken Wilber, many other people that just talk about this is what enlightenment is, this is what Buddhism is, this is what you have to know and engage with, without really being, again, embedded in like practice. Like there's I think an interesting, I talked about that last time, I don't want to really like commandeer the conversation, but maybe to encourage a shift in conversation. Like what are the types of practical, and then this is a bad way to phrase it. This is where like it's important to be able to ask a good question. I'm working on developing that skill. But what can 6 people, I know 4 people here, I know only which 3 of are at least in the United States. I don't know Damien, I don't know Sal, but I talked with Matt, David, and Kai before. So like there's kind of a geography about that, and we have to be really practical there. Like what is that we're working possibly in very different spots. I know myself and Kai and David are in different cities. So, we're in different states. We have different systems that we're engaging with. We have different cultures that we're engaging with. But we want to create something, we want to move towards that thought space. We have to figure out practically what that means. And for me, that has boiled down to questions that are like, well, what do you normally do in your day-to-day life? What types of interactions you're already making? And how do we bring awareness to those and the systems that those are a part of, and do it in a way where there's alternatives, meaningful alternatives that we can invest in, purchase from, interrelate with people through.
Well, yeah, and I guess I'm saying that I feel like what I'm saying is that what you're describing is actually a type of like enlightenment in action, and I guess I'm saying that it's like a little bit beyond. That enlightenment might be beyond our normal way of thinking about it and talking about it. That like when these people are saying that the people at the highest stages of development are enlightened or something like that, that it's not that they're wrong. it's just that maybe their ways of thinking about what it means to be enlightened are wrong, or too limited or something like that. That like it's like what you're saying. It's like, well, it really translates into practice and how you live your life, and like realization as a type of verb, like, and I think like you could talk about it in different symbol sets too. It doesn't have to be enlightened. It could be something like, Christ consciousness or something like that. Do you have the ability to exist in eternity and see Christ in your brother or something like this, and
I almost feel
act in that way?
We should even be more concrete than that. Like I want to push back and say that that's okay, and say like actually we need to be able to talk about like, this is how I'm physically a steward of the land I live on. Like that's something that all of us have to own up to collectively and individually, because we do it every day. Like we engage with the land, we consume resources, we put back in, or we don't. We live in a way that's generative and in relation to ecology, or we don't. And to talk about these religious ideals detached from that as a means of practice leaves me thinking that it's bad religion. It's not getting into what I see, and people can disagree here, but as what I see is some of the fundamental existential questions that we face around resource consumption, around, COVID is a good example. Like, what does collective world health look like? How do we come to terms and grapple with that? But how do we do it very practically in our day-to-day lives? And what type of systems, super systems, or top of our day-to-day lives do we need to create? Or, what systems do we already have? Can we co-opt and work towards those ends? And what do we maybe need to, stop feeding so that it eventually goes away because it's not working towards those ends?
Yeah, I'm with you on that too. I think it's important to know how these ideas cash out and what the real cash value, I guess, is of something like, enlightenment or believe, like seeing Christ in your brother or something like that. It's like a lot of that talk is just, in general, too vague and doesn't lead to a lot of clarity. I'm gonna go ahead and pass it back to Kai, and we'll go around again, and we'll just continue the discussion maybe for one more round. I'm sorry that we were a little bit disorganized today. It's great to have you joining us, Hunter. And let's go another round. What's up, Kai? What's on your mind, man?
Okay, so going back to this idea that Hunter brought up about like enlightenment and what you're talking about. It's hard to like listen to somebody talk about enlightenment and talk about, all right, well, no, I've studied this, I experienced this, I'm enlightened. And it's like when somebody makes that kind of an argument, I don't care like how incredibly complex that argument is, it always comes down to like, am I going to take your word for it? Like, yes, you can make the distinctions along the way, but it's like, this is your enlightenment. Like, that's like those things that you did led to you becoming enlightened, and that's what it is for you. And there is definitely, specific information that helps along the path. And, I think when it comes to something like that, like making certain claims about like, this is the true way is reductionist and doesn't actually paint an accurate picture for each individual person going through this entire process. And so, while we can take value from what they're saying, to just take them at face value and go, oh, the symbols they're using is what I need to know so that I can be enlightened and be in the same camp that he's in. And it's like, no, we're all on our own. Like, we all exist within our own reality. We all have our own way of interpreting information. And like, we're going to, come to enlightenment in our own way. And we have to kind of be humble about, what we know and like the claims we can make about these specific things, which is why Integral is awesome. Like, we actually have a language that we can communicate with. Like, and we can have, like, I can, talk to you about certain topics, and there can be consensus, especially these large, overarching ideas and philosophies. Especially with this whole emergentist like perspective, we're not getting bogged down and confused with these more spiritual, ontological claims where you just lock yourself into your own perspective, your own reality, and since I can't know if anybody else out there is true or real, then I'm just gonna, live my life and do whatever it is I do, or, so it's. I guess
seems like you're saying that in a sense that we can both know that there are different ways to potentially realize our own development, and also that it's also the case that a lot of people who say that they're enlightened are actually delusional, or the symbols that make them think they're enlightenment actually get in the way of them actually being in touch with reality. And with this map, we can start to figure out both what's true and what's relative.
I don't want to discredit like the work that they've done, and they very well could be enlightened. And this is why I say, like, okay, this person saying it, all right, it's a pretty bold claim. It's hard to know if that's true or not, but I can at least, take some value and listen to what they have to say. I think it's like somebody that is truly enlightened isn't going to come out and say that they're enlightened. Like, it's that whole, like, those who know don't say, and those who say don't know kind of a thing.
You think that's right? No, I think we're using the word enlightened a lot, and it's and
maybe we should define it's just like that. It's just, I don't know. Like,
What do you think enlightened means, Kai, when you say it?
you can understand and deconstruct your, the culture that you're in. You understand that reality we experience and process is based on symbols that we're trading around symbolically through language, and that's developed through our sense experience of the universe as humanity has evolved through time.
So you're talking about like an existential enlightenment, basically, like realizing that we're not like seeing through the relative nature of symbolism or whatever, something like this.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would maybe also say it's like a realization of absolute unity and interconnectedness, right? Like a lot of times I think the idealist camp, they cash this out by saying that we're all a part of a collective conscious or something like that. Like we're intersubjectively connected or something like that. And I think in the more emergentist realist camp, it's like E equals MC squared. We're all part of the universe. Like we're interobjectively connected. And that's like a fact claim. So combine that with this existential awakening that you're talking about, and I would call that enlightenment. So I think that enlightenment is actually aware and awake, while the more inside the box Vedic kind of enlightenment, Eastern enlightenment that some of these other people talk about doesn't actually have the existential awakening part that you're talking about,
right,
because they're still interpreting it inside the symbol set that they're stuck in. Right. Exactly.
Right. And so like when I hear more of these kind of Eastern like ideas brought to the forefront and being like, I'm enlightened, it's like, okay, yeah, you have like that more interior enlightenment that you were talking about there. But when it comes to
Kai, based on the definition that I just gave, realizing that we're all a part of the universe and being able to know the relative nature of language, do you understand those things?
Yeah.
Look at this guy claiming to be enlightened. Get out of here. No, I think it's fine, like it's fine to be enlightened and to know you're enlightened. I don't think it means that you're done.
No, I think that's kind of like you're just now like stepping in the door. Like there's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's more like a beginning than it is like a final completion or anything like that. It's not the goal of life. It's like a means to other ends, practical ends, not like an end in itself.
Right.
If enlightenment is good, what is it good for? Right. If you were God the whole time and just didn't know it, what's the difference between knowing it and not knowing it? It's only of value if it's good to know it for something.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So, I'm trying to remember where I was going with this point.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's fine. I guess it's just like in a public forum, like making public statements about being enlightened. I just don't think it's the most healthy or helpful way to communicate with people, because you just turn a lot of people off. And it's like, that's not what we're trying to do. We're not trying to like front or like flex on people. We're trying to communicate and actually build like a real community where we can, help people along, wherever they're at in the path, like, going into these more idealistic traditions and being idealistic. I think it's probably, part of the path, and it's something that, everybody goes through at some point. But, understanding how to build that synthesis between that more logical Western, enlightenment kind of stuff and the more unitive Eastern idealism kind of things, and knowing, where do those things exist within the quadrants, and how do we interact with that, and where can we make claims and not make claims about certain things.
It's important stuff.
Yeah, it is really important stuff when it comes to wanting to communicate and build off of that.
And I agree with you that enlightenment and claiming to be enlightened is probably not the best way to communicate about these things.
Yeah.
Do you have any other questions or comments or anything before we pass it?
No.
Well, I'm not very versed in enlightenment. I've met some people at a gathering around spiral dynamics and integral that claimed to have enlightenment experiences with being like you said, a God, a part of God, or something like that. Well, they had experiences, as far as I know, as far as I can tell. Yes, they had experiences. It changed them, of course. But I don't buy what they say. I don't buy the divine stuff. I don't buy I can go on many planets and see all around and okay, but as you said, what's the point of this? What is it good for? I didn't see anything like that in what they said. They were very concerned about their own enlightenment. They were also trying to be very humble about it. They spoke about it because it was the topic, and but they don't really like to brag about. But well, what's the point? What's the use of this? Where does it lead? I don't see. I really would have liked to tell them, but I was maybe the only one that's very buying the other stuff. I really would have liked to tell us, why don't you share your experiences with other planets to astronomers to find new planets to live in? Well, that was not the point of the meeting, so I didn't do this. But that's one of the way they could be used. They could use their knowledge. They say they know many things. They say that they have absolute knowledge and whatever. Well, okay, produce something, share, give us something. But I never heard from this kind of people. I never hear anything like that. I never hear anything about what we don't already know. And it's always looks very like what we already know. They use the same words, nothing new. But who am I? I'm not practicing meditation. I don't have this kind of practice in my life. So I don't know enlightenment. I don't know what it is. Maybe I know it very mentally, but I don't know if I know it really intimately. My understanding of, well, I say understanding, my connection to the world is, well, I've always been very interested in sciences and in biology, medicine, physics. And so, of course, we are part of everything, and of course, we are made of everything. And of course, we are the star, and of course, we are living beings among many living beings. That's how I'm connected to everything, but I don't pretend to be connected to some kind of ethereal stuff.
I think from this more emergentist perspective or whatever, there's definitely a version of like sacred naturalism where like if God is just absolute, whatever the absolute is, then God could be absolute reality. So to say that you're one with absolute reality is to say that you're a part of God. I think it can be beautiful to talk about things that way. I think it's an easier way to say it is just to say that we're interobjectively connected, or that you see life as sacred. And so that's why you could maybe talk about it in that kind of a way. But yeah, at the end of the day, if we're going to see that we're all connected, the point is that we should act like it. Right. And if we don't act like it, if we think that we could just cut ourselves off and go off and be in like a mountain somewhere or sit and stare at the wall forever, then it seems like we missed the point. It should be about how we treat each other, how we live together, how we treat the planet, this kind of thing.
Currently involved in projects around deep ecology. So this is a way to make this connection between our concern for other beings, this connection with the world, and trying to make a difference.
Yeah. And as we spoke about, we need to find more beautiful, poetic ways to talk about this stuff, so that way it will resonate with more people.
In deep ecology, we use poetry and sacred naturalism. I don't know very much about sacred naturalism, but I think we do some kind of this. And so, yes, we speak to people about life is sacred. We are connected to each other. And sometimes with these notions about interdependence, interconnectedness, this kind of stuff. So it's easier, and it's a way to bring people back to a relation with nature, with their own nature also. And it works better because it's different from the common language. It's different from the common techno-scientific language. So people are drawn to this, and it's kind of an open door, because they're used to technoscience, and you offer another way of doing, of thinking. And so they tend to go this way. They are looking for other ways, but they don't always know how.
I think it can be very inspiring and very moving to people, the interconnection, like in the same reason that we have the symbol of Christ or something like that as this dying person. It's like through compassion for others that we're able to really connect with love and like give of ourself, So I think there's something like deeply psychological that works with this idea of using interconnection and compassion as a way to provoke spiritual practice and hopefully activism that leads us to be able to have a sacred way of communing together and to building things and refining together. So yeah, I think the poetry is actually really good. I'm super inspired by the creative, responsible kind of narrative that I get in the more emergentist, the sacred naturalism camps versus the more bypassing idealist stuff. Like, I mean, like, yeah, I guess it's like, it feels nice to be like in bliss and stuff personally, but it's like, I don't know, my heart really gets activated when I'm in the world with other people and like that I, and like really engaging in the stuff, in like the muck of reality feels like much more of a spiritual practice to me than like staring at the wall. And I think that you can, of course, still work on self-mastery and being here now and state control and, all this kind of stuff. You still need to like have your mental shit together to be able to do that. So it's not like it's like one or the other, but yeah, I think that's a much more beautiful path, in my opinion. What do you think, Matthew? This is coming back full circle to what we were talking about.
I was thinking of a Michael Dowd quote where he said,
awesome. I love Michael Dowd.
Reality is my God, ecology is my theology, and evidence is my scripture. So it's like a bridging of the scientific and those metaphorical spiritual imagery. I guess he's more an emergentist. Spiritual, but then incorporating spiritual metaphor into that.
Yeah, he's definitely an emergentist. Actually, I think I got the idea of specifically saying emergentism as opposed to materialism from him, because materialism has such a negative connotation.
I guess it still is difficult, though. It's going to be difficult for some people to let go of religious beliefs when they're metaphysical in nature. So when you're talking about things like afterlife or reincarnation or something, that there's no answer that emergentism has to that. So that could be a roadblock in convincing people to let go of those metaphysical beliefs or idealistic beliefs.
Well, from a really enlightened perspective, even within those traditions, there's no self, right? So right. God would be the only transmigrant, really. And I mean, what's the difference between saying, oh, we're all aspects of God versus saying we're all aspects of the universe that's in constant flux, recycling? The only difference is that people want to like track some kind of personal thread where like my soul moved through time like this and that.
Maybe that applies more to like traditional people, they want to believe in like a personal heaven, a personal afterlife or something. But then on the flip side as well, they also have the personal hell, which is something that needs to be obviously, that can be unhelpful, like even psychologically to your current development. But one thing that I want to say about thinking of enlightenment, it's a term with a lot of baggage, I guess. And like even when you and Kai were talking about it, it's very slippery. It's difficult to get a hold on it, a definition of it. But what I was thinking of framing in terms of, I think it's Wilbur spoken about when you look at lines of development. So spirituality could be one particular line, and you can become developed in that, but it doesn't necessarily affect the other lines. It's just an independent line of development. So it could, and this is again where Wilbert seems to break his own rules, because then he does seem to elevate enlightenment to some all-encompassing thing which covers everything. And when you become enlightened, that it elevates you to this higher level where you're a transcendent level. But he sometimes has qualified that with saying there are different lines. So you could be highly developed in that spiritual line, but then underdeveloped in interpersonal or social skills, for example. So you can't enact that enlightenment in the real world. And there's lots of examples of spiritual teachers who claim to be very enlightened, but their action doesn't reflect that. And sometimes their personal, their shadows and their personal psychological and emotional issues are amplified by that enlightenment. They tend to have more their abusive relationships with their students, for example. But I guess you could think of it as just maybe one line, and if you want to think of it in the emergentist integral 2.0 framework, it's a state training development. So you could be highly without taking into account metaphysical pronouncements, that you're highly trained in state training, but you have to work on the other lines as well. You don't just want to stay in these particular states and then not actualize them and ground them in reality and
Right.
in the real world.
Wilber also describes it in like the Wilber-Combs matrix as like state training is horizontal development. Like he says, states are free. Like you could get into any state at any stage, but you'll always interpret it at whatever stage of development that you're at. So he almost sees it as like this is why it's a bit of a contradiction, right? He's like stacking these extra stages on top, but he's also saying that you can become a master at it at any level of development, but your interpretation of it will change.
And he seems to hold that up as an ideal enlightenment. Maybe it's not explicit, but it's a lot of times implicit, like this is something we're really striving for.
Right. So it's like, it's a little bit confusing. Like, what is it? Is it horizontal and free for anybody who, at any stage, who it wants to put in the work, or is it a measure of cognitive development? It seems like it can't be both at the same time, especially if you can have a master who's at blue. So
well, I've heard him speak about it as that it's vertical, but if you practice state training enough, it can lead to horizontal development. Right? Like the line, like enlightenment is an accident, but if you practice enough, you get more lucky or something.
More accident prone or whatever.
More accident prone, right?
Yeah. He describes it as like meditation as like lubing, putting some lube on the spiral to help you like flow up a little bit better. I mean, that makes sense.
But I don't know if there is empirical evidence that still, I guess it's still something that needs to be studied more. What gets people from one stage to another?
Well, I think that you could, I think he has a bias, because I think that you could do work in any quadrant and potentially make developmental progress. For example, yes, will it help you if you can have mental control and emotional control in the moment? Absolutely. Will it help you if you study philosophy? Absolutely. Will it help you if you engage with the people around you in your life more honestly and skillfully, like a relationship type approach to life? Absolutely. Will it help you if you work on your self-mastery? Absolutely. All four quadrants, all four, aspects of spiritual practice promote growth. Focusing on one alone is kind of reductionist. I mean, sure, they all add lube to the spiral, I guess is what I'm saying.
Right, just the upper left kind of meditating and looking inward is just one aspect.
Yeah, one aspect of spiritual practice that helps with development.
Do you think it's... Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to add to that. Talking about meditation, being lube on the spiral, and it allows you to kind of develop. In my developmental process, I didn't do a whole lot of meditation. It was in there, but it wasn't the forefront. For me, it was definitely more just practicing art, and specifically photography, because as I used that medium, I'm developing my own sense of how to express that medium. And it's a physical object that's creating, you're having to work in the physical world. And as I'm trying to make a business, and you start to see the potentiality of this kind of a device, you see how imagery affects people, and it can change how they process information or think about things. And so it's activating that we space. You can create these whole spaces that people can kind of agree upon with imagery, and then you're also thinking systematically with photography. You're thinking about how it can actually be applied in these larger projects to hold space with imagery. And so it's for me at least, that's what it felt like, was constantly hitting all of these different quadrants with the medium helped lube my understanding of I don't know, of all these different perspectives, I guess, with developing the self. So I don't think it's even exclusive to meditation, as a thing. It's definitely one path, and it emphasizes the interior realms, where something like photography, you get the interior realm because you are expressing yourself and you're having to think internally about how you want to like apply yourself to it, but it's like it's more focused in the exterior. It's more focused like maybe in the community, because you're working with communities. Like one thing I've definitely done is like worked in the international community as a photographer, like capturing the students at the universities in our town, and allowing them to see like create space around the images of each other, and being able to find this communion or community with all this diversity. So yeah, I don't think there's like one way that it can be done. There's definitely other ways that you can.
Well, Kai's a photographer, so he talks about it in the context of his line of photography.
Right.
And
it's just, yeah.
It's
you say practicing photography in a spiritual way. It's almost as a spiritual
right,
practice.
because this is the upper right quadrant self-mastery type of approach, and he's saying that through photography, through his focus on self-mastery, that he's had to push into these other quadrants as well, of like, working on his own states, getting involved in the community, creating that we space, and then having to also develop these kinds of structures. So it's like, yeah, like you could do it through any line, or like even like Wilbur could talk about it like this too, where he's like, through my personal spiritual practice, I've studied a bunch of philosophy of Buddhism. I started working on my own discipline, and I got plugged into a spiritual community, and like I'm sure
or through writing even.
Yeah, or through writing. Yeah, so I mean, like, if you push into any line, if you start in any quadrant, you could probably end up in the other ones too, But ultimately, Wilbur says that it's giving equal emphasis to all four quadrants that makes you healthy at whatever stage you're at. So take it from him, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, it's still kind of a slippery term, so I guess there needs to be, when one's talking about it, one needs to be clear of the definition beforehand, and it can turn a lot of people off.
The enlightenment term.
Yeah. But what you and Kai said makes sense. But grounding in all four quadrants, and there's not only one path to exercising that skill.
I might kind of pose the question though: if we're talking about these developments, there's a lot of lines that kind of overlap amongst ourselves, just as normal people engage in communities, and maybe just an element of focus for collective work might be examining, again, like I think the economic example that was used earlier, it was right when I got on the phone call, so I'm not sure exactly what was being said about it in context, but everyone is consuming things, and what does development in that line look like, individually, collectively? I think those are important questions that maybe can push this conversation towards some points of design, maybe design questions for ourselves of how do we move forward in enacting some of these developmental ideas in these other spheres that maybe overlap more commonly with other people.
I feel like that's a really good question, and it's definitely something that we should spend probably a very long time pushing into and thinking about. So like I'm thinking that on the back of this community conversation that we'll probably do another poll, and we can generate some ideas about what our next topics for future meetings can be. I was thinking that would be our last round, but maybe I could do like another quick round where we go through and just say final thoughts and goodbyes or whatever. Yeah, I really want to thank everybody for showing up today. I feel super blessed to be in a group with so many smart, cool, and awesome people from all over the place. And I look forward to more dialogues and talks with you guys in the future. Yeah, I just feel overwhelmingly blessed to be hanging out with all of you. Just scrolling back and forth and looking at all of your beautiful faces. Thanks so much for hanging out.
This has been a lot of fun, very informative. I'm definitely new to this, and so I've only been in Integral for a couple of years, so thank you for bearing with me. I feel like it takes me a second to get to the ideas that I'm trying to talk about. I can see things in my head, but to translate that into words can be a bit of a challenge sometimes. So thank you for listening, and yeah, I'm looking forward to more of these talks. I think this is really helpful and healthy for our community to kind of get to know each other and keep the conversation, whatever that conversation is, at least keep it rolling. So thank you all.
Thank you, David, for this invitation, and thank you all for the participation and dialogue. That's nice to meet you, not in real, but at least through screens. I will be glad to meet you again, maybe in the next gathering, or maybe on Facebook, if you are on Facebook, I suppose, through conversations. And I'm glad to have had this conversation with you. Thank you.
It was a really interesting conversation. A lot of had some of my questions answered and some new questions formed, I guess. Thanks for setting it up, David, and thanks everyone for participating.
Yeah, thank you for hosting these community meetings. There was a lot of benefit, interacting with all of you. And as a final note, I think our main goal would be to bring back the balance to the integral community by, eliminating a little bit of idealism, or like putting more, having more varied symbolism and find really practical ways to practice the philosophy that we believe.
Thank you all. Sorry I was late, but it was nice to be able to join in the conversation and kind of hear what's being talked about. I feel rather fortunate, just reflecting on the whole conversation, that I haven't run into too many people that tell me they're in the light. That doesn't sound like a fun conversation to navigate from anyone who's experienced it so far. But I appreciate the time to engage in this space with all of you. So thank you very much, and look forward to seeing how this does translate into practice. I think a great part of this and important thing for me to recognize is that this is kind of a different conversation, or a new conversation, in terms of accessibility and in terms of how it's being structured and how the space is curating itself for others and welcoming people in. So I'm appreciative of that, because it doesn't feel like there's huge barriers to entry outside of willingness to engage. And I think that that's important. I think that a lot of people can often come to a table and be like, I'm here, I realize it's work, I'm not perfect. And in response, if someone throws like 6 textbooks at you and they're like, figure it out yourself because you're in over the head, it's like, well, no, that's not a good way to phrase and kind of engage with what you have and how you share. I mean, if you're passionate about what you're doing, you should have the capacity or the bandwidth to be able to engage others along those lines. And if it's something that's supposed to be accessible and a part of your work is transcending and including, you should also be able to translate what it is that you're saying and doing to other people. So I appreciate that about this conversation. It seems that there's that effort going into it. So thank you all very much.
Big respect. Big love to everybody who joined today. What a great note to end it on. Thanks to everybody who's watching later, be it on YouTube or in the group. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Support me on Patreon. Come join us at the I Am David Long Friends and Fans Facebook group. That's where the best conversations are going down. I will see you next time. Peace.